I used to believe something very simple about love, that if someone truly loved you, things would naturally move forward. Not perfectly, but forward. That was my assumption until I found myself in a relationship that slowly started to challenge everything I thought I understood. At the beginning, nothing felt wrong. In fact, it felt stable, comfortable, even reassuring. We talked about the future all the time, not in a vague way, in detail, where we would live, what kind of house we would have, the kind of life we would build together. And over time, I stopped questioning whether I was part of his future because it sounded like I already was. He didn't say I that often anymore. It became we. We should go there one day. We should get a place like that. We'll figure it out together. And I started to believe that maybe that was what certainty looked like. People around us believed it too. Friends would joke when the wedding would happen. Family would ask casually, "So when is he proposing?" And I would smile because I didn't have the real answer. And I also didn't feel like I needed one. Everything already sounded like it was heading in that direction. At least that was what I told myself. But something strange happens when you stay in a situation long enough. You stop noticing movement, not because things are moving, but because you get used to the pace or lack of it. Months passed, then years, and somewhere along the way, I started noticing small things I used to ignore. The future we talked about never became a timeline, it stayed a conversation. Always something we would do someday, never something we were actively moving toward. And I remember convincing myself that this was normal, that maybe people just take different paths to the same destination. But one day, I came across something someone said that relationship that stayed with me. He said, when a man truly sees you as his wife, you don't just hear it in what he says, you see it in what he does. At first, I didn't think about it much because in my mind, I already had proof. We talked about everything, we planned everything, we imagined everything, but then I started paying attention differently. Not to what was being said, but to what was actually changing. And that's when I started noticing something I had avoided thinking about. Nothing was really moving. There was no clear step forward, no real shift in direction, just comfort, just routine, and just we will see. At some point, I stopped asking questions out loud, not because I had answers, but because asking started to feel uncomfortable, like I might disrupt something that wasn't stable enough to withstand pressure. So I stayed quiet and I started adjusting, slowly, without realizing it fully at first. People think waiting is a conscious decision, but it's not always like that. Sometimes it just becomes your normal. 1 year turns into two, two turns into three, and every time someone brings up marriage, you smile a little differently than before because inside you are no longer as sure as you used to be. The hardest part wasn't that there was no proposal, it was that nothing ever clearly broke. There was no moment I could point to and say, that's when everything changed. Because nothing changed, and that made it harder to understand than an actual ending. I started thinking about all the times he said we, all the plans that sounded like commitment, all the conversations that made the future feel guaranteed, and I began to wonder something I wasn't ready to ask out loud. If everything sounded like we are building a future, why did it feel like I was waiting alone for it to begin? And that's when I started to understand something I didn't want to admit. It's not always that someone lies about the future. Sometimes they believe in it in words, but not in movement. And once I saw the difference, I couldn't unsee it anymore because life can feel real, plans can feel real, even promises can feel real. But clarity is something else entirely. Clarity moves, confusion stays. That's the part that changed everything for me. Not a breakup, not a fight, just a realization I didn't arrive at immediately, but one I couldn't ignore once it showed up. Because eventually I stopped asking myself, does he love me? And started asking something else, something quieter, something harder to sit with, something I wish I had asked earlier. Was I in a future or just in a story about one? And that question changed how I see everything after that. And that thought stayed with me longer than I expected, not because it was new, but because I had already felt it before. I just hadn't been willing to name it yet. At first, I tried to push it away because everything on the surface still looked fine. Nothing had changed in a dramatic way. There was no argument, no betrayal, no clear reason to question anything, just time and silence in places where clarity should have been. I kept looking back to our conversations, the ones about the future, the ones that sounded so certain when we were in them. We'll move one day, we'll get a place together, we'll figure it out when the time is right. At the time, those sentences made me feel secure. Now, they started to feel open ended, like they could continue forever without ever turning into action. And that's when I started noticing something I hadn't paid attention to before. The future we talked about always sounded real, but it never came closer. It stayed at the same distance. No matter how much time passed, no matter how many conversations we had, it was always ahead of us, never approaching us. Remember one moment that didn't feel important at the time, but I think about it differently now. Someone asked again about marriage, casual conversation, normal setting, nothing serious, and I remember smiling before he even answered because I already knew that the answer could sound like soon. He always said it calmly, like it was already decided, just not now. But after that moment, something shifted in me, not outside, inside, quietly, almost unnoticeably. I started paying attention to something else instead of words. His decisions, not the plans we talked about, not the conversations we repeated, but what actually moved forward in real life. And that's where the gap started to appear because life wasn't standing still. Everything else around us was progressing. People were getting engaged, moving forward, making decisions, closing chapters, starting new ones, but our chapter felt paused, not ended, not moving, just paused. And the hardest part was that I couldn't point to a moment where it became obvious. There was no turning point I could explain to someone else. If someone asked me, when did you start feeling unsure? I wouldn't know how to answer because uncertainty doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it builds quietly inside routines that look completely normal from the outside. I started noticing how often I adjusted my expectations, not in big ways, in small ones. At first, I told myself maybe it's not the right time. Then I told myself maybe he's focusing on stability. Then I told myself maybe I'm overthinking it. And without realizing it, I had already started building patience around something I once thought would be clear. And the strange thing is, he never stopped being present. He never disappeared. He never gave me a reason to walk away immediately, which made everything more confusing. Because when nothing is wrong, it's hard to justify why something feels off. But eventually, I began to understand something uncomfortable. The absence of a problem doesn't always mean the presence of progress. And I think that's where I got stuck the most. Not in doubt, but in clarity that refused to arrive. Because part of me kept waiting for something to happen that would explain everything. A moment, a conversation, a decision, something clear enough to make sense of the waiting, but it never came. Instead, life just continued. Softly, predictably, without interruption. And somewhere in that continuation, I stopped asking myself when things would change, not because I had an answer, but because I had slowly learned how to live inside a question. And that's when I realized something I didn't want to admit at first. Sometimes you don't notice you are waiting, you just notice one day that you've been waiting for a very long time. And once that realization settles in, everything starts to look slightly different. Even the same conversations, even the same promises, even the same we, because now you start wondering whether we was ever pointing somewhere or just keeping you emotionally close without ever moving you forward. At some point, waiting stops feeling like waiting. It becomes life. Not because anything changes, but because you adapt to what it doesn't. I didn't notice the exact moment it happened. There was no announcement inside me that said, from today you are waiting. It was quieter than that, more gradual, almost invisible. I stopped bringing up certain questions, not because I got answers, but because I started learning which questions didn't lead anywhere. And over time, silence became easier than repetition. People still saw us the same way. Nothing on the outside looked incomplete. If anything, it looked stable, predictable, even comfortable. But inside that comfort, there was something harder to explain. A feeling that time was passing without changing direction, just repeating itself in different forms. Birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, all happening, but not leading anywhere new. And I remember one night, lying awake, thinking about something very simple, not dramatic, just honest. If someone asked me today what we are moving toward, what would I actually say? I didn't have a clear answer, not because there was nothing there, but because nothing had been defined. Everything existed in conversation, nothing had been anchored in reality. And that's when I started noticing something else, the way I reacted to questions, because people don't always ask directly. They hint, they smile, they ask casually. So when it is happening, and I realized that I had to learn how to respond without revealing anything, a smile, A laugh, a vague answer, soon. But inside, I started feeling something different each time I said it, like I was repeating a word that meant less and less every time. And then I came across different opinions about situations like this, different voices, different perspectives, none of them agreed. One of them said something that stayed with me. He said, love is not what makes a man commit. Safety does, stability does. The feeling that life can actually be built with you. At first, I resisted that idea because it sounded too logical, too detached from emotion. But then I started thinking about it differently because if that was true, then love alone was never the full equation. Not for commitment, not for marriage, and that created a conflict in my mind because everything I had always believed was simpler than that. I thought love naturally moved toward commitment. I thought time would take care of the rest, but time was already passing and things weren't automatically changing with it. Then I heard another perspective, a much harsher one. It said, if it's been years and there's still no proposal, stop waiting for potential. People know early what they want. That one hit differently, not because it was necessarily true, but because it removed comfort, it removed excuses. And for the first time, I found myself sitting between two ideas that didn't match. One said, be patient, people move differently. The other said, if it hasn't happened, it's because it's not going to. And I didn't know which one to believe, so I stayed where most people stay in that situation, in the middle, not deciding, not leaving, not fully trusting, not fully letting go, just continuing. Because continuing will feel easier than confronting uncertainty directly. But the emotional weight of that space is something people don't talk about enough. It's not heartbreak, it's not closure, it's something quieter, longer, harder to explain. It's the feeling of being emotionally committed to something that is not clearly committed to you in the same way. And the longer it goes on, the more normal it starts to feel until you forget what clear even felt like. I think that's when I started changing without noticing, not in decisions but in expectation, slowly lowering what I expected clarity to look like, telling myself that maybe this is just how things take, maybe everyone goes through this phase, maybe I just need to be patient. But deep down, there was always a part of me asking a quieter question, not loud enough to act on it, but loud enough to feel it. If something is meant to move forward, why does it feel like I'm the only one noticing the stillness? And that question never answered itself. I think the hardest part was realizing there was no single moment I could point to, no obvious turning point, no fight that ended everything, no betrayal that forced clarity, nothing like that. It was just time, passing quietly without interruption. And I think that's what made it so difficult to understand. Because when something breaks, you know where you stand. But when nothing breaks, you keep standing in the same place longer than you should, trying to make sense of something that isn't collapsing, but also isn't building. I used to think clarity will arrive on its own, like eventually something would happen that will make everything obvious. A conversation, a decision, a proposal, something that will remove all doubt instantly. But that moment never came. Instead, life just kept moving forward around me. Other people were moving into new phases, getting engaged, starting families, making decisions that changed everything, while mine stayed unchanged, not worse, not better, just the same. And somewhere in that sameness, I stopped recognizing what I was actually waiting for, because I wasn't waiting for love. That was already there. At least I believe it was. I was waiting for direction, for definition, for something that turned words into something real. And slowly, I started noticing something I had ignored for a very long time. The future we kept talking about was always spoken about in a way that didn't require arrival. It didn't demand timing. It didn't require steps. It just existed as something you could always return to in conversation. And I think that was what confused me the most, because it felt like a future, but it never behaved like one. Then one day, I stopped asking myself the question I had been avoiding, not because I found an answer, but because I realized I had been asking for the wrong version of it. It was never just, does he love me? Because love was never the issue. The question I should have been asking was simpler and harder. What is actually moving forward? Because love can exist in conversation, love can exist in comfort, love can exist in familiarity, but direction is something else entirely. And when I finally looked at my situation through that lens, I couldn't unsee that what had been there the whole time, not absence of love, but absence of movement, and that didn't come with anger or drama or a single breaking point. It came with something quieter, more final in its own way. Clarity, not a kind that arrives loudly, but a kind that settles in slowly until you realize you're no longer confused, just aware. And I think that's what changed everything for me. Not a moment of ending, but a moment of understanding. Because once you see the difference between something that feels like a future and something that is slowly moving toward one, you stop confusing the two. And maybe that's the hardest truth I had to accept was this. Some things don't end dramatically, they just quietly stop progressing. And when that realization finally comes, you don't feel relief first. You feel awareness, then distance, then clarity. And maybe that's what people don't talk about enough. Not heartbreak, not betrayal, but the moment you realize you were emotionally invested in something that was never clearly defined in the first place. So if I had to leave this with one question, it wouldn't be about love. It wouldn't be about timing. It wouldn't even be about marriage. It would be this. Are you building something with someone or just living inside the idea of it? Because one of them moves forward and the other one can last a very long time without ever changing at all.